Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, May 21st, 2019. Time for yet another show. These things keep coming over and over again. Nothing we can do, apparently, to stop it. Do we need to? Should we put some checks and balances in place? It might be the first time we ever really enforced anything like that in this country, so why not? We might as well inspire, say members of Congress, let's just say, to do their jobs. Why would they do that? I don't know. Things are heating up on the, on the impeachment front. I mean, quite honestly, what other front is it? And what else could you name it? Lots happening today. Some court decisions to review. Apparently a caucus meeting yesterday at which there were some disagreements expressed and reported on as between portions of the Democratic House leadership and its rank and file, though, of course, its leadership claimed to be speaking on behalf of its rank and file. But lots of disagreement about whether, of course, impeachment ought to be moved forward, whether it ought to be a goal, whether it ought to be something at least open to consideration, and annoying. One of the more annoying things, one of the things that really actually gets me steamed is members of Congress telling the public, or even other members of Congress, feeding them garbage that is procedurally based garbage that they just assume either nobody knows the answer to or no one will look it up, or it just sounds so official and it's coming from an official source, and so therefore no one will ask any questions. And it really bothers me. And when you use that tactic to shut down debate, especially debate on something important about which people are feeling passionately, it is troubling and troublesome. Where do we begin? We might as well begin then with the, perhaps that's the hottest topic. This morning, let's see, lots of people talking about it. Where are the things I put aside? Let's see, the Washington Post and Politico both had reporting. Now everybody's got reporting on what happened during the caucus meeting. Although really, I guess the place to start is, and I don't know, this wouldn't have been necessarily the reason for the caucus meeting, but it drove a lot of what was going on. So perhaps we back up just a little bit and take a look at what developed yesterday. Let's see, I said first that there was a court decision out there, and let's see, I think the first I saw of it was David Farenthold actually tweeting about it, and let's see, Washington Post has such a story, Politico I think had the first story out, but Farenthold was tweeting yesterday, a federal judge just rejected Donald Trump's attempt to block a subpoena sent by the House to his old accounting firm. And then he just linked to a story from the Washington Post about what the House was looking to learn about in subpoenaing the old accounting firm. Politico has the story on the decision, although maybe I should put that off to see. I'll read you the discussion in Politico, and we'll see whether Armando wants to chime in at all, because, this is kind of up his alley. And I know he's been talking about it on Twitter a lot, and, he might want to take the opportunity to talk about it on the radio, too. Tuesday being an open day for that sort of discussion. And then from there, perhaps we move on to a couple of the other legal developments. Let's see. First, though, Politico's reporting from Andrew Desiderio and Kyle Cheney. Judge upholds Dem subpoena, and it is a congressional subpoena, not a Dem subpoena, for Trump financial records. That, I guess, coming out of the House Oversight Committee. Elijah Cummings, who plays a part in the caucus meeting story as well. At least his name is invoked, and we'll get to that in just a minute. So here's the story about what the federal judge did yesterday. A federal judge on Monday upheld a congressional subpoena seeking President Donald Trump's financial records from an accounting firm, arguing that Congress is well within its rights to investigate potential illegal behavior by a president, even without launching a formal impeachment inquiry. So important development there. On the legal front, granted, this is just a district court judge. The Trump team has already indicated an interest in appealing this decision, which they can always ask for. Whether or not they are granted the appeal is up in the air. They probably will, just because of the players involved. But I've already seen commentary this morning saying, speculating that there's very little reason to think that the D.C. Circuit would be likely to reverse this ruling. It seems pretty solid, actually. And, we think so only because it seems pretty much based on exactly the reasoning I thought courts would use, including and we're thankful for it in a way, although I suppose strategically we might have wanted a different statement of things just to push people a little harder on getting to opening an impeachment inquiry. But it's important to note that the judge said, you wouldn't need to have an impeachment inquiry underway to get at these records. Important distinction before we go too far into the discussion about it. I just chatted a little bit on Twitter about it yesterday with Armando. This ruling wouldn't affect the question of the court's power to release or order released Rule 6E grand jury information that was under consideration in a prior proceeding, a different proceeding. But it does at least reiterate that it isn't the case that you would need to have an impeachment inquiry underway in order to enforce your subpoenas in general. It's a question of whether or not you would be able to subpoena or petition otherwise for the release of grand jury information that was redacted from the Mueller report. But in the general question of subpoenaing some third party, in this case the accounting firm, for the accounting records, no, you wouldn't need to have. I mean, it probably would strengthen your hand if you had it. It's just that your hand doesn't need any strengthening. It won't do any harm, in other words. The only harm it could do is if people conflate the two different scenarios. And, for instance, if the leadership were to say, see, the judge says you don't need an impeachment inquiry in order to enforce these subpoenas, so let's not have one. And let's say rank and file members in favor of moving ahead with an impeachment inquiry wouldn't know offhand to say, well, wait a second, there's also a judge, though, and it's at the higher level. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals suggests that with respect to grand jury information kept from us under Rule 6E, there's a suggestion that an impeachment inquiry might be necessary in order to get at that information. It's just the rest of the subpoenas shouldn't be blocked, but you never know who would decide otherwise. And also a reminder that it wasn't a unanimous decision of the D.C. Circuit Court to rule out that the inherent powers of the court itself could be leveraged to release the grand jury information. There was one judge who dissented and said, yep, this is an improper statement of the law. This is not the state of the law. And it may very well be that as a whole, the D.C. Circuit agrees with the dissent on that question. And they wouldn't have to overturn the case in order to get to that and to fix it, by the way. All right. So back to what actually happened yesterday. This federal judge said, we're upholding the subpoena to the accounting firm, and Congress is well within its rights, doesn't need a formal impeachment inquiry in order to enforce this subpoena. That was, remember him, U.S. District Court Judge Amit Mehta, M-E-H-T-A. His ruling delivers a striking blow, that's interesting, to the president's efforts to resist Democratic investigations and is certain to give Democrats further legal basis to investigate Trump, his finances, and his presidential campaign. In addition to upholding the House Oversight and Reform Committee's subpoena to accounting firm Mazars USA for 8 years of Trump's financial records, Mehta took the extra step of denying the president's request for a stay pending appeal. That's good news, too. Jay Sekulow, one of the president's personal attorneys, said, "We will be filing a timely notice of appeal to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals." Timely notice just meaning we'll file it in time so that we don't lose the opportunity to ask for an appeal. It doesn't guarantee an appeal, but you can guarantee not getting an appeal if you don't file timely. That is to say, before the the time allotted post decision runs out. I don't know. People just love using that terminology, I guess. It makes it sound like you have a basis for your appeal when all it's saying is we're only allowed to file an appeal up to X days after the initial decision is rendered, and so we're going to do that. Anyway, just makes it look like you're fancy talking the reporters into believing you have a case. Speaking with reporters at the White House on Monday, Trump called Mehta's ruling, quote, ridiculous and, quote, totally wrong, unquote. He also noted that Mehta was appointed by President Barack Obama because our president is a partisan warrior jackass and doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut. Mehta's decision is a sweeping repudiation of Trump's claim to be largely immune from congressional scrutiny, particularly in matters of potential legal violations. I mean, it was a stupid claim anyway, so, I guess any repudiation is going to be sweeping because the stupidity involved was so sweeping. But okay, Mehta's opinion emphasizes that lawmakers have the authority to investigate Trump's conduct from both before and after he took office. The ruling represents the first time the federal judiciary has weighed in on the ongoing oversight battle between Trump and House Democrats. Mehta's ruling is likely to provide a blueprint for other judges who are set to make their own rulings on Trump's vow to defy all congressional subpoenas. Well, of course, they won't be ruling on his vow. They will be ruling on the individual subpoenas. I don't like this imprecision in the description. It leads to problems. And also, even though they're correct eventually in saying this, the ruling represents the first time the federal judiciary has weighed in on the ongoing oversight battle between Trump and House Democrats. That's true. It will be read, and people will walk away, unfortunately, largely, with the belief that the ruling represents the first time the federal judiciary has weighed in on the question of how to settle ongoing oversight battles between the president and Congress. And of course, even again, here they refer to House Democrats and not Congress. We won it. The Democrats won the majority of the House of Representatives. The House is Democratic. Yes, that's true. But it's speaking as the House of Representatives. It's true that there are people inside who disagree, but so effing what? That's how the House of Representatives works. So they just, I don't know, reporters still refusing to see it in anything other than partisan terms, still refusing to give the due weight of the subpoenas to the subpoenas coming from a House of Congress. I don't know why they continue. I do know why they continue to do it. It's jerky and stupid. Anyway, no, you shouldn't come away with the idea that this is the first time the federal judiciary has weighed in on fights between Congress and the president. They haven't. And that's part of the reason why this ruling is so strong and has such robust backing to it. It stands on precedent. Yes, the judiciary has ruled dozens of times before on things like this, although they tend to try to avoid the question of what happens when the immovable object meets the irresistible force. The question of whether or not the subpoenas are valid has been passed on a number of times, and this is just one more. In a 41-page opinion issued Monday, Mehta systematically dismantled the Trump legal team's arguments against the validity of the subpoena. He was able to do it systematically because there's plenty of precedent for it. And he pushed back on claims from congressional Republicans that the House Judiciary Committee must formally launch an impeachment inquiry before issuing such subpoenas. Good. This is a quote here from the decision, "It is simply not fathomable that a constitution that grants Congress the power to remove a president for reasons including criminal behavior would deny Congress the power to investigate him for unlawful conduct, past or present, even without formally opening an impeachment inquiry, Mehta wrote. Mehta noted that Congress has twice investigated alleged illegal activity by presidents Richard Nixon and Bill Clinton, yes, and others as well, but those two, one, in the first case, Nixon came very close to an impeachment, and in Bill Clinton's case did come to an impeachment. Quote, Congress plainly views itself as having sweeping authority to investigate illegal conduct of a president before and after taking office, Mehta wrote. This court is not prepared to roll back the tide of history. By the way, the tide of history in this context, very much, I think, relatable to the thing I keep bringing up, Justice Frankfurter's Youngstown dissent, in which he describes the gloss of history and how long-standing practice that goes unchallenged can sometimes stand in for, I guess, be the next friend of, to borrow more stupid legal terminology, stand in for actual explicit authority when constitutional officers have been doing something for a long time. It's not defined, of course, how long they have to do it for, and have met no resistance. It very often becomes an assumption that the court is willing to recognize as legitimate and base its decisions on it going forward. It very often becomes a legitimate basis for authority. The president filed suit last month, of course, to block this subpoena to his accountants, arguing that it amounted to an improper and overtly political abuse of congressional authority. Mehta eviscerated that argument, too, emphasizing that a judge's analysis of a congressional investigation, quote, must be highly deferential to the legislative branch. In other words, you can't get in the way of a co-equal branch just because you want to. Thus, it is not the court's role to decipher whether Congress's true purpose in pursuing an investigation is to aid legislation or something more sinister, such as exacting political retribution, Mehta wrote, adding that there are, quote, fundamental problems with Trump's legal arguments. There certainly are. That isn't even the quote that I grabbed out of it, but it actually addresses the same thing. This being the question of whether or not there's a legitimate legislative interest in whatever information or testimony that they're seeking. Although I think that's easily covered if you are considering whether or not to issue, to adopt articles of impeachment, that's legislation. It comes in the form of a resolution. Boom, legislative interest. But they're using this excuse across the board in this subpoena to the accountants, in subpoenas demanding testimony from various White House and campaign actors, and in the request for an unredacted version of the Mueller report, including grand jury information. All of this across the board, the Trump team falls back on the same arguments that they conflate as between the very separate and distinct questions that are being asked in these different cases, and keep saying things like, well, first of all, across the board, you're not allowed to investigate the president, period. Second of all, that even if you were allowed to investigate the president, you aren't allowed to investigate in this case because you don't have a legitimate legislative interest. And on top of all that, I guess there's, you don't have an impeachment inquiry underway, and so therefore your request is denied as well. None of those things actually work. The only thing that stands a chance of working, the only thing that stands a chance of working at this point is preventing the release of the grand jury information that's been redacted from the Mueller report. And that, as I was going to say, even that stands only on the relatively shaky new ground that 2 out of the 3 judges on the D.C. Circuit Court think that it shouldn't be considered within a court's inherent powers to simply release grand jury information. They might be willing to release it, and probably would be willing to release it in the context of an impeachment inquiry. Say, even the two judges who have doubts about the inherent authority of the courts, but one judge who's just as much a D.C. Circuit judge as they are says, no, I don't see anything that stands in the way of that at all. I totally disagree on the question of whether or not a court would have inherent power to release that information. And I'd be willing to bet that several other judges on the D.C. Circuit Court feel the same way. And at a rehearing en banc, you might very well come out with a different question. Ordinarily, in a less partisan Supreme Court, if they appealed directly and the Supreme Court took it up rather than having an en banc hearing in D.C. Circuit first, they too might disagree and say, there's really nothing about grand jury information that makes us think that courts wouldn't have the inherent power to release it. We absolutely could. I don't see why you would give that power away. We shouldn't. We may yet rule that in this case it's not warranted, but why give away the constitutional power to do this? There's no sense in doing that, and it doesn't require getting to that question to resolve this particular issue either, and the Supreme Court in particular loves to settle things that way. Yeah, no constitutional question here. We absolutely do have this power. We're just not changing the outcome because we think, we might say remand it down to the district court for a ruling on whether or not, given that the Supreme Court says it's within the inherent power of the court to release 6E information at your discretion, does your discretion demand its release or not? Separate question, and avoids making a constitutional decision that doesn't have to be made at this point. But it would be appreciated if they would just lay that out there. Anyway, so where were we here? Yes. The court's role, as Mehta says, is not to decipher, or rather, it's not the court's role to decipher whether Congress's true purpose in pursuing an investigation is to aid legislation or something more sinister, such as exacting political retribution, which is a very broad statement of the case, allowing, as Mehta does here, for the very possibility that the Congress might have a sinister motive in exacting political retribution, and still that by itself might not be enough to defeat this subpoena. It leaves open the question, of course, and you could, I guess, come back and argue that question later on, either in this case or in another one. But it looks to me like what he's trying to say here is, yeah, this is one of those political questions we just don't settle. In other words, is there a legitimate legislative interest in, for instance, the 6E information? Is there a legitimate legislative interest in, what else was out there? Certainly we learned it doesn't matter with respect to the accounting information, but let's say the tax returns. That's another separate question in a different case. Does the Congress, and that's another place where they've conflated things, the Trump team, and brought up that objection. There's no legitimate legislative interest in the tax returns that the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee has, quote, requested of the IRS. That's one of their many excuses for not turning the information over. And my simple answer is, if the legislature asks for it under this statute that explicitly gives them the power to do this and requires the Secretary of the Treasury to hand them over, says they shall hand them over as soon as the request is made, then that answers the question. Is the legislature interested? We are. There's your legislative interest, ladies and gentlemen. It creates itself. You express the interest as the legislature, and that makes legislative interest. Is it legitimate? Not for me to decide. That's what Mehta is saying in this case, and that would be an easy standard and the right standard to adopt in whatever case is going forward on the question of if there is one. I don't think it's been filed yet, on the question of the tax returns. But this settles the issue. Now, moving on with this article. Oversight Committee Chairman Elijah Cummings issued the subpoena to Mazars last month as part of the panel's investigation into whether Trump committed financial crimes before he became president. He did, but that's not answered in here from the court. That's not up to them yet. In particular, the committee has sought to corroborate specific claims made by Trump's former personal attorney and fixer, Michael Cohen. That's another big issue in the news today. Transcripts of his question and answer period, his interrogation, have been released as well. Lots of people talking about that. Earlier this year, Cohen turned over documents to the panel which purport to show that Trump artificially inflated and deflated the values of his assets to suit his personal financial benefit. That is awkwardly stated, but okay. For example, Cohen told lawmakers that Trump submitted false financial statements to Deutsche Bank. What, them? Yes, them. In 2014, as he was seeking a loan to buy the Buffalo Bills NFL team, which was never a good idea. The court recognized the basic but crucial fact that Congress has authority to conduct investigations as part of our core function under the Constitution, Cummings said in a statement, and he's quite correct. Mehta emphasized that even though the committee never adopted a formal resolution outlining the purpose of its investigation, many other factors would deem the probe legitimate. Mehta pointed to Cummings' reliance on federal ethics law, for instance, in letters outlining the purpose of his investigation, and noted that legislation could conceivably be connected to the results of that probe. The judge also noted that Congress has unique constitutional power to oversee potential emoluments or improper foreign payments steered toward the president. I guess let's just pause here for a second before heading into the break to say the way they did that in scare quotes, potential emoluments or improper foreign payments. Emoluments aren't improper foreign payments. They're payments of any kind. It's improper when it comes from a foreign government without the express authority of Congress. But emoluments aren't illegal payments. They're just payments. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal, except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Just trying to line up a few other things that we can discuss. Yes, as we were going out to the break, I just wanted to point out, again, for the sake of clarity, you report these things in somewhat clouded ways, and people come away with the wrong impression, and it creates problems later. Like, for instance, I don't know what the situation would be, but you could see the next Democratic president comes along and whatever, blah, blah, blah. And he I don't know, before becoming elected president, he runs a business of some kind or whatever. He doesn't run a business, but he performs something. He reads an audiobook. He records an audiobook of the articles of impeachment against Donald J. Trump, for instance. I would buy that, right? And he gets paid for doing it. And somebody points out, aha, that's an emolument. What about all of you Democrats who said emoluments were wrong? This presidential candidate has accepted an emolument. I mean, it's like that old grade school trick of, did this happen to everybody? I don't know. I guess kids in my grade school learned the word and decided to make to use it to worry other people who might not know the terminology. That is, say, other younger elementary school kids walking up to them saying, "Hey, yo," like pointing at their zipper, "Your epidermis is showing." And people would say, "Oh, my, what?" Yeah, I don't know. The kids were doing that. The 6th graders were walking around to the 3rd and 4th graders saying, "Your epidermis is showing." I didn't know what it was either, but whatever. So people, "Oh, what is that?" Yeah, it's still showing. Oh, epidermis. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. Now I understand. Now maybe you don't. Maybe you have to look it up, right? Your skin is showing. Of course it is. That's, or there was, to give it a better political context, there actually was, who was doing this? Was this, down in Florida, of course, Florida man. Let's see, what was the story? There were campaigns. Was it Claude Pepper was the senator from way back when down in Florida? Was it? Let me see if I can look up this story. This is a distraction, of course, but that's what the story is about. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. There we are. Legendary campaign. I'll look that up here from the New York Times, 1983 story. Legendary campaign, Pepper versus Smathers in 1950. So this is a 1990 or 83 archived article about the 1950 Senate race. And did this come out because did Claude Pepper, had he just died in 90 or 83? Is that, I don't know. Anyway, that part of the story I don't remember, but here's the deal. This is an inquiry into a political legend. The legend began 32 years ago. This is again back in the 80s in Florida's Democratic senatorial primary, and it reaches forward in time to the comfortable offices where today two aging men enjoy the rewards that often come with a long public life in the city. That is to say, one rich in influence, the other in money. In American political folklore, Representative Claude D. Pepper and former Senator George A. Smathers are yoked together as the principals in an election renowned for its flamboyant oratory, ideological ferocity, and personal drama. Their contest cost Mr. Pepper, now 82 years old, so he's still alive at the time, his Senate seat and his presidential aspirations. It also left Mr. Smathers, the ostensible victor, with a reputation, unearned, he says, but unshakable, as a political hatchet man. Do you recognize the story? Let me skip down to this part here. Oh, well, I don't need to skip. As any campaign junkie worth his subscription to the Almanac of American Politics knows, did they still print that? The Smathers-Pepper legend depends on one key quotation that seemed to sum up the rivalry between the two men. Here's a quotation from Time magazine here. Mr. Smathers, now 69, nice, was supposed to have dazzled rural voters with a barrage of double talk that went like this. I'm sure they had an accent, right? Are you aware that Claude Pepper is known all over Washington as a shameless extrovert? Not only that, but this man is reliably reported to practice nepotism with his sister-in-law. And he has a sister who was once a thespian in wicked New York. Worst of all, it is an established fact that Mr. Pepper, before his marriage, habitually practiced celibacy. Yeah, I mean, if you haven't heard that story, that's a great one. But is it true? I don't know. Let's find out. Since these words appeared in the April 17th, 1950 issue of Time magazine, they have been reprinted in numerous articles. Writers as different as Robert Sherrill on the left and William F. Buckley Jr. on the right have used the purported quotation in their books. I guess that's your answer. There's only one problem with the legendary remark. Mr. Smathers said in a recent interview, it's apocryphal. I offered $10,000 to anybody who could say that you would come up and testify and pass a lie detector test that they had ever heard me say anything like that. Ironically, in the same article, Time, claiming unnamed northern newspapers, described the purported quotation as a yarn of doubtful authenticity. But the words took on a life of their own, and I guess the rest is history, even if it's entirely unfounded history. I don't know, but it's a hell of a story, and worth noting that it's possible that it's not true at all, but that's the sort of thing to which I'd be referring. And so these are the mistakes I think people can come away with, and making slight errors like that can lead to enormous problems, or not lead to any problems at all because that story didn't really actually happen. And yet, still, here we are telling the story nonetheless. So emoluments, long story short, not illegal. There are regular, the emoluments of office, the $400,000, I think it is, that we pay to the President of the United States as salary. That's an emolument. It's just an okay emolument. I didn't really need to spend that much time explaining that, though, did I? But it got me to another story. That was fun. Back to the first article. We haven't made it all the way through our first article yet. Congress is also allowed to investigate presidential conflicts of interest and a president's conduct before and during his term, Mehta ruled, pushing back on an argument from Republicans that Congress shouldn't be investigating Trump's conduct that predates his political career. You do what you want, basically, is the rule in Congress, and very few instances there are in which a court will stand in the way. That Mehta ruled in favor of House Democrats wasn't entirely unexpected, because that's like the freaking law. Last week, he heard arguments from Trump attorney William, what's this guy's name? Consovoy, and House General Counsel Douglas Letter last week, during which the judge cast serious doubt on Consovoy's legal arguments, because they were dumb. Consovoy contended that Congress has no legitimate authority to investigate whether the president violated the law. Period. End of sentence. Although it's not the end of sentence. Comma, continuation of sentence. Because such probes are handled by law enforcement entities and aren't tied to a specific legislative remedy. So yes, in this very case last week, the President's counsel was arguing that without a specific and legitimate legislative interest, they weren't entitled to this information. But Mehta pushed back strongly on Consovoy during the hearing, stating those types of investigations are strictly within Congress's purview. Here, too, by the way, another structural weakness of the journalism model we have set up for ourselves. I don't know if there's a model that can defeat it. I don't think it's journalists' fault. It's just this is the problem with linear time, right? Last week, Consovoy makes the argument, and everybody covers it, that Congress has no authority to conduct these investigations and something, blah, 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 legitimate legislative interest. That all got printed. Lawyers made the argument. They totally wore suits when they did it. They were in an oak-paneled sort of room with a judge in robes and gavel and everything. And so, therefore, that's a statement of at least one plausible theory of the law, except it isn't and wasn't, and the judge said as much, or hinted as much, at least at the minimum, in the hearing. And a really good write-up of it, a good analysis of what went on there would have included, yeah, the judge was super skeptical of this terrible, terrible argument. This is a very novel argument. If you didn't want to pass judgment on it, it's a novel argument. It's not based in anything. It's extraordinarily aggressive. And it's just not grounded in any sort of reality at all. But the judge entertained the argument because that's what judges do. It was pretty obvious from his response that, next week or so when we get a written decision, it's gonna crap all over this theory. It's gonna seek to shut this theory down forever because it was horrible, stupid, and really damaging to the Republic that we even heard it made in a courtroom and have got to print that it's a, supposedly legitimate legal theory. It is not. Put it out of your mind. Forget you even heard it mentioned. But instead, it gets printed and there's a photo of a suited and possibly bespectacled lawyer, a respected member of our local legal community, after all, just zealously advocating for his client, which he's supposed to be entitled to do. And everybody comes away with this impression. And though the judge and everybody there knew it was BS the moment the guy said it, we have to wait a week in order to get the written decision that says everything that guy just said is BS. And because of the delay, even if it's reported heavily this week, right here, like this, that was crap from start to finish. The moment he said it, he knew it was crap. But will people read the follow-up article? We will. Will everybody else? Will people who saw it on the news just sort of casually mention, even correctly reported? You can report it absolutely correctly and give all the analysis that it's due, and people hear it just in passing, see things out of the corner of their eye. Oh, yeah. Legitimate legislative interest. Okay, that's a thing? Okay. That's a phrase I'll use to argue with people online now. It's not a phrase. It's not a thing. It never was. It's not an argument. People who still use it are idiots and probably never read this article. And you should point to this and shut it down and give them a copy of this podcast too. And give me a gavel and a robe. I'll hit them over the head and tell them it's wrong. That's one of the problems with, our society, linear time, and life. I don't know how to fix it, except podcasts, I guess, is the answer. All right. So Mehta, yes, pushed back strongly on Consovoy during the hearing, stating those types of investigations are strictly, and that's in quotes, strictly within Congress's purview. Strictly meaning, shut up, you're an idiot. There's not even, no, you're not allowed to question it. No, suit, spectacles, zealous advocacy, who cares? Don't even say that. That's not a legal thing. Move on. He also said Congress has the authority to investigate conflicts of interest. For example, whether a president has a financial interest in a particular piece of legislation that was being considered. In addition to the Mazars suit, Trump has asked a federal court to invalidate the House Intelligence and Financial Service Committees, two committees, Intelligence Committee, Financial Services Committee, invalidate their subpoenas to Deutsche Bank and Capital One. Those subpoenas also seek Trump's personal and business financial records as part of a joint investigation centering on whether Trump is compromised, financially or otherwise, by foreign actors. Trump and his GOP allies have argued that the Democrats' probes, they are the House's probes, of course, are illegitimate and amount to an abuse of power. Tough crap, but that's the way to. But once again, this does fall on the shoulders of the journalists and headline writers. Stop referring to it as a Republican Democrat thing in every mention. I mean, that's true that it's there and it underlies everything, but give the House its due. Okay. Second to last paragraph mentioned that in addition to the Mazars suit, Trump has asked federal courts to invalidate House Intelligence and House Financial Services Committee subpoenas. The fact that other committees are working here becomes important in the next article I'll bring up for review. And I note here that this too is from Politico, and we may be doing you a disservice by reading so many articles from Politico. It may not be a fair and accurate representation of what's going on in the world, but it is it has the kernels of truth in there somewhere. We just have to tease them out. And in some papers, it takes more teasing than it does in others. But do keep in mind that Politico is a very strange animal. And I think you all know that. And you know how big a grain of salt to take this with. Next up, Heather Kagro, John Bresnahan, and Sarah Ferris is reporting on the caucus meeting. Pelosi clashes with fellow Dems in closed-door debate on impeachment. All right, I have things to say about this as well. House Democratic leaders sparred internally on Monday over whether to begin an impeachment inquiry against President Donald Trump, with Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her allies rejecting the call to move forward for now, according to multiple sources. Representatives David Ciccolini, and all right, that's it. We got to find out about this guy's pronunciation. His name keeps coming up. I feel bad about this. And I checked on the White House counsel's name, so I might as well check on his name too. Let's see. Where do we go for this information? Let's go over to YouTube and see if we can find an interview with him where they say his name. All right, just curious. I'm going to have to unmute the system here and see if we can do. Oh, let's see. Well, it's a good short interview. I hope this one will have the information. Let's just see what we got. I hope there's no commercial. Hey, oh, of course there is a commercial. All right, let's see. Well, maybe this is a waste of time. I'm certain that it is. Oh, skip ad. Okay, we can do that. Oh, Fox and Friends is going to tell us.
Better wages. That sounds like it's going to be the new slogan Democrats are going to unveil later today.
Yes.
Week after week, month after month.
Oh, blah, blah, blah. We want to talk to...
Pieces here
this is Chuck Schumer and his setup for the debate. Let's see. Where do they get to... Here we are. Okay, let's see.
Last few months hashing out the new agenda. David Ciccolini spent the last few months hashing out...
Okay, that answers the question. Do we trust Fox News with that? He doesn't then go on and say, it's not Ciccolini, it's Ciccolini. Okay, Ciccolini. All right, fine. I think that's, he should go with a different pronunciation, but that's maybe what he told Fox News. I'll check on it again later. David Cicilline of Rhode Island, Jamie Raskin of Maryland, and Joe Neguse of Colorado. Have I mispronounced his name? We'll have to look him up too. I don't have time to do all of them, but Cicilline comes up all the time. Jamie Raskin, by the way, I'm glad he's there in Congress. I should point out, Jamie Raskin was an outspoken advocate of impeaching George W. Bush back in the day as well. And I think it's important to note that he's been working on this issue and has a background in these kinds of clashes between the presidency and Congress for a long time. So it's no surprise that he would chime in on this. So, Cicilline, Jamie Raskin, and Joe Neguse. Okay. All members of Democratic leadership. Really? Sorry, Joe. I should know better then. Pushed to begin impeachment proceedings during a leadership meeting in Pelosi's office, said the sources. So it wasn't a full caucus meeting. Okay. Pelosi and Representatives Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut. Do we need to tell you where everybody's from? Ben Ray Lujan, Hakeem Jeffries, and Sherry Bustos. Do you want to know where they're all from? Read it yourself. Some of our key allies rejected their calls for impeachment, saying Democrats' message, whatever that is being drowned out by the fight over possibly impeaching Trump. Raskin, a former law professor and state legislator, and impeachment advocate, said he wasn't advocating impeachment or impeaching Trump specifically, but suggested that opening an impeachment inquiry, as Armando has frequently argued, would strengthen their legal position while allowing Democrats to move forward with their legislative agenda. Of course, we should point out, Judge Mehta says, at least on the question of subpoenaing his accounting firm for their documents, opening an impeachment inquiry makes no difference. However, it's not necessarily the case that all other judges agree, particularly the judges above him on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court. So there's no reason not to go with belt and suspenders on that one. Pelosi, though, dismissed this argument, asking Raskin whether he wanted to shut down the other 5 committees working on Trump investigations in favor of the Judiciary Committee. And here she's apparently quoted, "You want to tell Elijah Cummings to go home?" Pelosi quipped, referring to the chairman of the Oversight and Reform Committee. Time out right here. This was widely quoted. Nancy Pelosi, please, honest to God. This is what I said in the beginning of the show. So now we get to this main point that's really been bothering me all morning. I hate it when members of Congress, members of leadership, rank and file, whatever it is, when they're talking with people who I guess they feel are subordinate to them, and I'm good argument there, Speaker of the House, right? But to feed them procedurally based gobbledygook as an argument in order to shut down debate. Like the point of that comment was to shame Raskin and Cicilline and Neguse and anybody else who was with them on this question into being quiet. How dare you? I don't want to, it was meant to probably make them say, well, I respect him as a senior member. We don't want to be in the business of silencing powerful people of color here who hold positions of influence and power in Congress. We need to let them have their voices. We can't stand in the way of that. That's an issue that probably looms. But to tell Elijah Cummings, as a person who has done so much work on this subject, that's it. You have to go home. The implication here is that if you move to impeachment, that becomes a Judiciary Committee show from there on. And all the people who've done all this work, Maxine Waters over at Financial Services, Elijah Cummings here, who else is mentioned? The Intelligence Committee, so Adam Schiff. You want to tell all of them to pack it in, to go home, your job is done here, and everything goes to Judiciary, huh? That's your view of things? No, of course not. And you know what? It's not really your view of things either, Speaker Pelosi. You know very well. At least I hope you should know very well. You're the Speaker of the House for the second time. And this would be the second president during who should have been subject to impeachment during your assumption of the highest leadership ranks in the Democratic Party in the House, you should know very well. Maybe you don't, but then the argument is, well, get a book. You should know very well. No, there's no reason in the world why anyone would have to tell Elijah Cummings to go home. The assertion that invoking impeachment automatically transfers jurisdiction of whatever investigation might lead to impeachment to the Judiciary Committee is simply false. It is wrong. It is based in nothing. If anything, it's based in a misunderstanding gleaned from having read in the newspapers, either in depth or in passing. I can't tell you about how she reads the papers, about impeachments and the way they've worked in the past. Did Richard Nixon, was his impeachment handled by the Judiciary Committee? Yeah, it was. Was there also a Watergate committee, though, especially dedicated to the investigation? Yeah, sure. Everyone remembers that. It was super famous and everything. All over the television. Did anybody tell Peter Rodino to go home? Not that I recall, right? So, I don't know. I'm sure somebody must have told him to go home. It was probably Republicans. But, yeah, I don't know where the idea where the idea comes from that you would have to shut down those other investigations. Now I'm thinking about it. Yeah, well, you know why they didn't tell Peter Rodino to go home? Because he was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. That's the point. Yes, but there were other committees working on the investigation, and I think I've misremembered my own history, and I don't know whose point I make in this one. But let's see. So make sure if we can get things sorted out here. And, okay. We'll look it all up. Yes, Sam Ervin. Okay. That would be the Senate Watergate Committee. But at any rate, the point is, I guess would have been better made simply by sticking to the original plan, which was to tell you that no, there's no House rule anywhere that says that impeachments and impeachment investigations must be conducted by the Judiciary Committee. If you go all the way back, I guess, to the first president who was impeached, Andrew Johnson, his impeachment inquiry was handled by some other committee. I think they actually had a Reconstruction Committee at the time because they were in the middle of Reconstruction, of course, following the Civil War. And they were the ones who conducted the initial investigation. And there's no reason in the world why Elijah Cummings couldn't continue on with his investigation, even if the Judiciary Committee started picking up on his issues. He could continue his. And as a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure there's really no reason procedurally why Elijah Cummings and the Oversight Committee couldn't issue or adopt its own articles of impeachment. I think the confusion comes from the fact that, one, in the case of Nixon, the Judiciary Committee handled it, and that's where the inquiry was referred, I guess, by the Rules Committee. If you introduce a resolution calling for the opening of an impeachment inquiry, the Rules Committee has the opportunity to, it gets referred to the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee can decide on who gets jurisdiction. And they don't have to decide that it's the Judiciary Committee. They're not obligated to do that. And likewise, they could simply send it to Oversight and Reform if they've had jurisdiction over those issues. Jurisdiction exists in Oversight and Reform to adopt their own articles of impeachment and send them to the House floor. It doesn't matter who originates the articles. So Maxine Waters could issue her own and continue with her own investigation. It's foolish. It makes me angry that the Speaker of the House would try to confuse the issue this way and shame members making the argument that we would do best to at least open inquiries into impeachment, that all of this had to go to the Judiciary Committee. And I guess maybe there's more evidence or tradition that leans toward or would steer you to the conclusion that impeachment inquiries need to be handled by the Judiciary Committee. And it's because the most frequent use of impeachment, a rarely used constitutional tool to be sure, but the most frequent use of it is to impeach federal judges. Those are the personnel, the federal personnel most frequently impeached, because there's lots and lots of them. Presidents are only very rarely impeached. Other officers of the federal government are from time to time impeached, or it's discussed anyway, impeaching them. But federal judges, far and away, the most routine kind of impeachment. Well, guess what committee would get jurisdiction ordinarily over the impeachment of a federal judge? And the answer is the Committee on the Judiciary. So the Judiciary Committee is the natural landing place for the vast majority of impeachments. But there's nothing about the jurisdiction of the Judiciary Committee that says a presidential impeachment must land there. Really, there's nothing that says that it should land there. It's just that usually if you're talking about impeaching a president, you're talking about a person who has committed some great offense against the Constitution. And arguably their jurisdiction falls to the Judiciary Committee. But the plain fact that they're in the business of impeaching judges doesn't give them jurisdiction over all impeachments. And there's nothing judicial about the proceeding either in any real sense. Although, I guess occasionally they do draw parallels between the Congress's impeachment power and judicial functions, yes, but that doesn't mean it has to go in the Judiciary Committee. The point is, it was wrong to say, period. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So, yes, okay, I think I've vented enough about that, but it really steams me when that sort of thing is done. And I can recall any number of battles with members of Congress in leadership positions where the right thing to do was very plain and obvious, but they insisted on spewing gobbledygook about rules that very few people understand in the hopes that no one would understand or even check or even do some research that would allow them to argue back about what can or should happen, and their pronouncement becomes the rule. I'm thinking in particular about Kent Conrad insisting from his perch at the Senate Budget Committee that, for instance, that the proposed reconciliation bill that would have the sidecar fix for the Affordable Care Act. You remember that? Those of you who really remember how the Affordable Care Act was passed procedurally might recall that the Senate version of the bill was unacceptable as written, just simply too weak to be accepted by the House majority. There was a huge faction of the House that wanted to see much stronger provisions in the Affordable Care Act. And I can't even at this point recall what the bones of contention were, although certainly there were some pushing for still the inclusion of a public option in the ACA. That didn't come to fruition. But we were stuck in this position of having to amend the bill as it stood before House Democrats were willing to accept it and pass it. And that created problems because, of course, in order to amend the bill, that meant it would have to go through the Senate again, and we no longer had the 60-vote majority necessary to avoid a filibuster on the proposed changes. And so the changes were set up as part of a reconciliation bill instead, so that it could muster the votes necessary to pass in the Senate. But then there was a fight over who would go first in adopting the Affordable Care Act as the base bill, and a fight over whether or not in the House, they said, well, what if we get screwed by the Senate here? Remember back in the days when Democrats just fought with Democrats about stuff like this? You forget about that, right? Our main opponents in getting this done smoothly were actually Democrats, and in fact, headed up by Democrats who we had previously nominated for high office in this country, but who thankfully are non-entities now, except for going on Fox News, which is another story of the day that we probably won't get to touch. But the question of whether or not, if the House were to pass the underlying Affordable Care Act as amended by the Senate, but which was in otherwise unacceptable form, and then pass the reconciliation bill, would they pass that over to the Senate? Would the Senate simply decline to take up the reconciliation bill or change things further and screw the whole process up? And Democrats in the House wanted some sort of guarantee, and the only guarantee they could get was either the word of Senate Democrats, which wasn't very good at the time, or seeing the Senate pass this bill or the Reconciliation Act first, or in fact seeing the reconciliation bill passed by both houses so that the fixes were in place, and then the House would accept the task of passing the underlying Affordable Care Act bill only when the fixes were safely past both houses would they then accept the underlying Affordable Care Act bill. And Kent Conrad and others argued vehemently that that was impossible, that the House simply had to take the Senate's word for it, pass the Affordable Care Act as written, then pass the reconciliation bill, and then the Senate would do the same with the reconciliation bill, and then the two would be merged. But that the argument was you can't pass a reconciliation bill with fixes to the Affordable Care Act in it because the Affordable Care Act doesn't yet exist. And really, honestly, there was no procedural reason why that should be the case. It made a certain amount of logical sense, but if you pass a bill that contains within it amendments to a bill that has not yet been adopted and, of course, not yet become law, that would be nonsensical. But if you did that, what would you do with it? Essentially, you would take the part of the law that is usable, the rest of the reconciliation bill that doesn't have anything to do with the Affordable Care Act, if there was anything, and enroll it and record it and put it on the books. And the rest of the stuff that says you shall hereby amend the Affordable Care Act by inserting the following words, you would simply say, oh, well, that doesn't exist, so I can't insert those words. So for now, I'm just going to stand here and do nothing because I have no instructions about what to do with it. There's no standing law that says, oh, well, if that refers to a bill that hasn't been passed yet, you have to throw it out. You got to tear it up and burn it. And then when that bill gets passed and enacted into law, you won't be able to add those changes because you will have torn up and burned the amendments that were proposed to it in the reconciliation bill, because that's what you do with legislation that doesn't make any sense. No, it just sits there dormant and does nothing. And then when the other bill is enacted and signed into law, then you say, remember that other piece that said we were supposed to amend that law? It just arrived in the mail. Let's go do the amendment. Boom, done. No worry about that. And the argument was made, well, you can't amend a bill that hasn't been passed yet. Sure you can. You do it all the time. And in fact, that's part of what reconciliation is all about. But no, for some reason, everybody concluded that, and there was a reason, and I have explored it on the air, I think, in the past, but everybody else concluded, no, we have to have the Affordable Care Act signed into law by the president first, and then you can pass the reconciliation bill and make sense of it. And it all kind of worked out in the end, but there really was never any serious reason why you couldn't simply have done it the other way around. And they ended up getting their way, and they ended up writing the first, second, and third drafts of the history of the passage of the Affordable Care Act with this mistake on the books that's going to end up becoming precedent for some other time in the future, where really, if you just write your reconciliation instructions carefully to begin with, it ended up coming down to the way the reconciliation instructions were written. They used to have boilerplate language that said basically that the instructions to the committees under reconciliation was to recommend any changes to law or pending legislation that would be necessary to, whatever, reduce the deficit, etc., blah, 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 all the reasons for reconciliation. And they forgot, or perhaps intentionally left out from the boilerplate language in requesting activity from, legislation from instructed committees on reconciliation. They forgot to say, or pending legislation. Recommend any changes to law that it would be necessary to affect the following savings, blah, blah, blah. And if they had simply said law or pending legislation, the excuse would have been gone. They've done it that way in the past. They conveniently forgot to do it this way this time. But instead, people will come away with the impression that the rule is you can't amend unenacted legislation with a reconciliation bill, when you can. Improper reporting, bad arguments being made by leadership who just want things done their way, and that bothers me a great deal, and I think you can tell that. All right, so back to the second Politico article, right after Nancy Pelosi says, you want to tell Elijah Cummings to go home? No, the only person discussing telling Elijah Cummings to go home is you, Speaker Pelosi. Do you want to explain why you keep bringing that up? Or brought that up once yesterday? Oh, is that uncomfortable? Have I twisted your words here? I'm sorry. I feel like you were twisting my words. That's so odd. Anyway, that wasn't the only meeting. Next up was a Democratic Steering and Policy Committee meeting, during which Representative Steve Cohen of Tennessee, since you all need to know where they're from, stood up and demanded Trump's impeachment. I don't know in what words, but it sounds fun. Pelosi then countered, "This is not about politics. It's about what's best for the American people," said a member who attended the meeting. And there's been some criticism of that. I will criticize it in saying that's meaningless. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. I mean, I guess the accusation was you're worried about losing seats in the House and you're putting politics above what's best for the American people. And she says, no, it's not the politics. I think it's about what's best for the American people. And yes, people are successfully pushing back on that and saying, well, maybe what's best for the American people is impeaching Trump. So at best, a matter of opinion. At worst, just a nonsensical statement. While Pelosi and her top Democrats argue that a majority of House Democrats don't want to impeach, she is under growing pressure from some of her most hardline members. What's that supposed to mean, hardline? To move more forcefully against the president. Several members and aides said an impeachment inquiry resolution could be introduced in the House Judiciary Committee in the next several days, spurring more Democratic debate over how to respond to Trump. Yes, that's another story out there. During the Steering and Policy Committee meeting, does everybody know what the Steering and Policy Committee is? That is a internal Democratic caucus committee, not a committee of the House, but a committee of the Democratic caucus, usually made up of hand-picked members by the Speaker and the leadership. But they are, among other things, the group that makes decisions about who will be assigned to which committees and basically work out internal matters of Democratic policy, Steering and Policy Committee. You know, what will be the leadership position on these things, and what are we going to do to enforce the leadership position on these things, and where should people get their committee assignments, et cetera, et cetera. That's sort of an internal administration committee for House Democrats. So, during this meeting, Cohen said President Bill Clinton faced impeachment proceedings, quote, over sex, unquote, while Trump is, Steve, quote, raping the country, unquote. And we really need to be better about using the word rape in these contexts, but I get where you were going with that. But, well, it's a word, I think, on its way out in terms of metaphorical use. Anyway, This, according to two sources in the room. Cohen later confirmed his remarks, though he should have changed his wording. Pelosi pushed back on Cohen during the meeting and his assertion that she was simply afraid impeachment would cost her the House majority. That's where she says, this isn't about politics at all. It's about patriotism. It's about the strength we need to have to see things through, Pelosi said, according to an aide in the room. I would need to hear more context to be able to make any sense out of that. As a bite, no, not helpful to me. The speaker mentioned that Democrats have not exhausted all options to hold the administration accountable, including levying fines via a process known as inherent contempt. This is a little bit worrying. Armando was laughing out loud, essentially, on Twitter yesterday, pointing to this thing and saying to me, oh, what? We haven't exhausted all options? You mean she's going to use inherent contempt? What's funny is apparently she does intend to give the impression that she intends to use inherent contempt. But the funny part is that, we use inherent contempt to levy fines, not arrest recalcitrant witnesses. Well, whatever. I mean, it is I guess, if you really want to chop things up into fine pieces, the next step. But the fines is a pretty stupid waypoint, if you ask me. Pelosi also tried to calm restive rank and file members by pointing to the legal victory Democrats won Monday against Trump. Remember? We just talked about it. Who tried to block his accounting firm from turning over his financial documents after Democrats issued a subpoena. What we said when we started is that these investigations will yield information to us. Today, we won our first case, Pelosi said. We've been in this thing for almost 5 months, and now we're getting some results. There's a lot to unpack there, including the fact that 5 months is not a particularly good record for getting to a district court decision that they will appeal, a district court decision that says, yes, the law as it stood yesterday is still the law today. Duh. He hasn't added anything here. I mean, he's reiterated a lot of good points, and I'm glad. But, I mean, this is just like part of the Republican approach to everything, and it's an approach Democrats enable. It's like we talk a big game about the value of precedent, and then we throw all precedent out. I mean, we didn't need this case to tell us that this was what the law was. Trump didn't need this case to tell him that this is what the law was. He simply wanted to burn time. I know what the law is. This is how they approach all of their legal battles. Well, Democrats and normal people say there's a lot of precedent that says you are not within your rights to refuse to comply with this subpoena. You have to. And Republicans respond to this uniformly, well, in two ways. One, with, I simply won't. I mean, what are you going to do about it if I don't? There's nothing, there's not much precedent for what to do if I simply say, I recognize that you think you have this authority, but I'm just not going to do the thing you're asking. But in addition, they also say, they approach all litigation this way. Well, what makes you say, rhetorically, they would ask, what makes you say that I have no choice, that I have to honor the subpoena? Well, all of this precedent. Well, let's take a look at this precedent. For instance, here you have precedent, I don't know, pick one out, like the old Gorsuch case, the Ann Gorsuch case. I don't think that actually, I don't know whether that made it to court or not. Or the John Conyers lawsuits about Harriet Miers and others who are recalcitrant witnesses and defied their subpoenas. So you look back at those and say, it says right here, when Harriet Miers said she refused to testify before the Judiciary Committee, we went to court and we won. And the court said, no, the excuses that Harriet Miers was giving, which are the same excuses or certainly no better excuses than, but in some cases, the very same excuses that you're giving now in these cases under the Trump administration are false. They don't hold any weight and you must testify. And Republicans look at that and say, I'll tell you what I see in here. This document right here tells me that Harriet Miers has got to testify to the Judiciary Committee. I'm not Harriet Miers. Well, we all say, I know, but I mean, it's not meant to apply just to Harriet Miers. It says right here, there's an order at the end that applies to Harriet Miers. This says Harriet Miers has to go. No, well, what it says is that Harriet Miers has to go because this is the law and this is the way things work. And here are the reasons why it's the law. Here are the reasons why it's the way things work. But what it stands for is the proposition that you cannot simply ignore congressional subpoenas as invalid, or that also congressional subpoenas are invalid because it's a law enforcement function and Congress isn't a law enforcement organization. That's what normal people read the law as saying. Republicans say, you're going to have to get a judge to say that Mazars USA can't refuse this, or Don McGahn can't refuse this. I don't care what they said to Harriet Miers. That's stupid. I'm not Harriet Miers. And that's just not the way things work. But we have to burn time. And it's going to take 5 months to get the first judge to say, come on, don't play dumb with me. You're under an obligation to turn that material over. How many months is it going to take to work it out now that Jay Sekulow says, yeah, we'll be appealing that to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, and maybe asking for a rehearing en banc if it doesn't come out our way, and then appealing it to the Supreme Court. And ordinarily, such a simple case probably wouldn't make it that far, but these days, who knows? And because the president is involved, who knows? So, big whoop. 5 months now down the road, we're getting some results. A federal judge is willing to say, yup, the law from last president and the one before that and the one before that and the one before that, still the law. Now, turn over the material. None of which, by the way, gets the material. It's still sitting in the offices in a man-sized safe, I'm sure, at Mazars USA. And if they just say, I didn't read that, what do? There's still nothing. You could try and send court officers to seize the stuff, I suppose. But could the Trump DOJ, William Barr presiding, say, no, there won't be any federal marshals doing that. Sorry. Stay home. Take the day off, as a matter of fact. You can't go. Sure, he could get in the way of that. Absolutely. And then we'd have to sue again. And then how long would it take to get a ruling that it's improper for the Attorney General to block the district court's marshals from going to seize the documents that have been lawfully subpoenaed? Another 5 months? Longer? What about the appeal of that? You see what we're doing here? It could take forever. 5 months is nothing to brag on. I'll say that. Also, what we said when we started is that these investigations will yield information to us. Today we won our first case. And again, to restate what you've won here, you've won the case. Where's the information? That's the point. I want information from Mazars USA. Well, when we started these investigations, we said it would yield information. 5 months later, we're getting some results. The result is a judge at the lowest level says, yeah, you should get that information. And now we're going to appeal over whether or not we get at the end of this thing. Suppose the Supreme Court finally says, yes. Finally, the law is Mazars USA. You have to comply with that. That takes a year to get to the Supreme Court finally to agree to this. Have we made progress? Are we getting some results? There are some results. Yeah. How much information has it yielded? Zero. Mazars still has it. Now they're under some obligation to give it to us, and the question begins, how do we get it? How do we make them give it to us? Where's my information? Speaker, Ms. Speaker, Madam Speaker, that's right. When we started this, it will yield information. Well, I'm waiting. Where's my information? I got a court ruling. I'm not that proud of it. I'm glad it happened, I guess, better than losing. But I didn't need a court to tell me that this was the law. I told you. And you assumed that it was the law when you started. Meanwhile, this was about information. Where's the information? All right, back to the article. The latest Democratic battle over impeachment began after the White House formally declared that former White House counsel Don McGahn, a key figure in special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation, would not attend a Tuesday, that's today, hearing before the Judiciary Committee. The White House decision to block McGahn's appearance infuriated some Democrats who said it was the last straw following Trump's refusal to honor other Democratic subpoenas. Cicilline said he supports an impeachment inquiry if McGahn doesn't show on Tuesday. Has anybody seen him? No, not so far. Let's check Twitter, just in case. Anybody saying, oh, here comes Don McGahn? No? Well, not yet, but I haven't seen all of Twitter yet, so I'll just keep looking around. You let me know if he shows up. So Cicilline says, I'm sitting on a committee here that's supposed to be talking to this guy, and this is the last straw, right? I think if this pattern by the president continues, where he's going to impede and prevent and undermine our ability to gather evidence to do our job, we're going to be left with no choice, Cicilline said about initiating an impeachment inquiry. The Rhode Island Democrat, because you got to know, insisted that simply beginning an inquiry doesn't mean that there will be a formal vote to impeach Trump. Very true. It's a means, he says, where we can collect that information. We need to have the ability to gather the evidence. That's true. And after all, Madam Speaker, you said when we started this process that it will yield information. And Cicilline simply wants to say, well, I got to have that information. And this appears to be the only way to get it. So the whole thing, I guess, or yesterday's meeting was actually, this tells us, the meetings were triggered by McGahn's his refusal to show up and testify. And of course, that has a whole bunch of other legal questions looming around it or swirling around it, including why would the White House be able to order a former employee not to testify? There's some reason to believe that the White House could order a current employee not to testify under some sort of an assertion of executive privilege. The fact that they work there isn't enough necessarily to make it stand. It's just that executive privilege, the way it's usually interpreted, if the employee is the sort of person that might have engaged in a considerable amount or even any discussion with the president during which he's, consulting with his advisors and getting their frank advice, etc., which might not be suitable for public consumption, forcing them to testify about that could pose some difficulties, some dangers to national security perhaps, or just simply the deliberative privilege of the executive that I have the right to get confidential advice from people. That is apparently a still recognized form of executive privilege, and it might work. But asking a former employee, is that any better? A lot of people say, well, that relationship no longer exists. Though I'm certain he would be asked to testify about things that he discussed with the president when he was covered by that privilege. So I'm not entirely convinced that just because he's a former employee, that argument disappears entirely. But anyway, apparently this is the thing that drove them to insist that they really needed to be open to discussing the I word in this series of meetings. So, Representative Ted Lieu now makes an appearance in this article. Another member on the Judiciary Committee is also in favor of an impeachment inquiry if McGahn doesn't appear. If McGahn doesn't show tomorrow, I think we're at an inflection point, Lieu said. If we can't get information, I think we have to start proceeding down this path. Pelosi, however, countered. Even after saying that this was all about getting the information, she still has a counter. She countered that Democrats have invested this much time. I don't know why we would say, McGahn, that's it. And the answer is because McGahn poses a slightly different question than many of the rest of them, in that he is a former employee, and that offers you the ability to press the question without affording the White House the excuse that he is a current White House employee and therefore must be assumed to be covered by assertions of executive privilege. And that sort of pushes at least part of the executive privilege question aside. And also, of course, because it's the latest in a long line of such refusals. But okay. Anyway, so we've invested this much time. Yes, 5 months and still no information, even though you said information was the paramount reason for pursuing these things. So I don't know. I think your earlier reasoning weighs against you on this one. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I guess we have some developments. I see from a tweet from The Hill, which we all hate or whatever, that says, here, we can watch on video. The House Democrats leave empty chair for McGahn as he defies subpoena. We could, I guess this link says we could watch that not happen live. So I guess that's your answer in terms of his showing up. I guess it's still Tuesday later on. Can he show up later and get away with it? Not really sure. And I see here from Credo Mobile tweeting that Representative Mark Pocan just joined the call for an impeachment inquiry, issuing the following statement. Regrettably, the president's most recent actions and continued disrespect for the Constitution are forcing us down the road to impeachment. Congress is a co-equal branch of government charged with oversight of the executive branch and with the power to subpoena information and individuals. The president and his associates are engaging in a campaign of obstruction and lawlessness that undermines the rule of law and does not reflect the actions of someone who is exonerated as innocent. Congress has a responsibility to conduct oversight and get the information we need to deliver the truth to the American public regarding Russia's interference in our elections. Don't limit it to that, but thank you for saying so. Stonewalling Congress on witnesses and the unredacted Mueller report, don't lean on this, only enhances the president's appearance of guilt, and as a result, he has pushed Congress to a point where we must start an impeachment inquiry. And you should start it on several fronts, and don't lean on the Mueller report. I know that that's the easiest thing we handed you from all the people who spent the previous month saying, wait for the Mueller report, wait for the Mueller report. And again, inaccurate and incomplete discussion of the issue leaves us with a caucus of elected Democrats whose press releases and sound bites will continue to make a partial and inaccurate case for the impeachment, and should anything fall apart with respect to the Russia inquiry or some other part of the Mueller inquiry or the entire Mueller inquiry, there are still numerous fruitful pursuits that could be taken up that would just as easily lead to impeachment. Like, for instance, the emoluments thing, the illegal emoluments to be precise, could absolutely be used to impeach him. Any number of things, quite honestly, could impeach him. And putting that much weight behind the Russia investigation and Mueller, I think, is foolish and short-sighted, though I think that it's probably unlikely that the whole thing will be derailed at some point, so it'll end up being okay. But then it'll just teach people that the correct tactic is to pick up a hot potato like this one and put all your chips on it. Potato chips. That's interesting. I didn't think I was going to get there with that one. Anyway, just a little strategic advice to people who don't really care or ever want to hear from me again. Okay. Moving on with the article we left off, that Pelosi was countering with Democrats having invested this much time, 5 months. I don't know why we would say McGahn. That's it. I do. And so do the Judiciary Committee members who feel very differently about having been stiffed so often. But I bet that it doesn't have to be McGahn. Ask Maxine Waters if she's had enough being ignored. Ask Elijah Cummings if he's had enough being ignored. Right? McGahn, I don't know why we would say McGahn, that's it. 5 minutes ago, Speaker Pelosi was putting it all on the Judiciary Committee. Now the Judiciary Committee, which she thinks should be taking the lead on all that, is coming to the conclusion that we're not getting anywhere. We're not getting results. We're getting court decisions that result in no actual help in getting information. So what are we going to do? We're going to have to take this into our own hands. Now, of course, the Judiciary Committee, who cares if they were stood up by Don McGahn? So now they're unimportant again. All right, back to the story. Hakeem Jeffries, chairman of the Democratic caucus, who also sits on the Judiciary Committee, rejected any move toward impeachment. I don't know whether really a blanket rejection of any move, but that's the way it comes out in the Politico story. We did not run on impeachment. We did not run on collusion. So logic suggests that we should carry forward with the agenda that we communicated to the American people, Jeffries said. And I think everybody, you could disagree, but everybody sort of understands the logic behind that. But I want to point out once again that, why didn't we run on impeachment? Because people like you and Nancy Pelosi insisted that we not do it. And that was a better strategy, not running on impeachment per se. But I and others advocated don't hide from it, because if it ever becomes necessary, people like you are going to say, we didn't run on it, so we can't do it. Well, what if we ran on other things, but also said, yeah, I'm open to impeachment, but that's not what I'm about. I'm running on this, this, and this, and this. I mean, you're asking me if I were to win on infrastructure and economic equality and protection for reproductive rights and getting people affordable health care. If I were to run on all of that, would I do my constitutional duty if I happened to be sitting there and somebody, committed major crimes and it was up to me to impeach them because that's what the Constitution says my job is? Would I do my job? Yeah, I'd do my job. Would I spend day and night ferreting out, leads to do this? Okay. Are you asking me? Yes, I would do that. Would other people? No. Would it be a productive use of my time? Really? No, probably not. But on the other hand, honestly, neither would be voting on anything because the Senate would kill it all. But okay. The point is, that's not the reason I'm going there. But if you ask me to do my job eventually, yeah, I'm going to do it. But you insisted that I deny that the I word even existed. And now, in a self-fulfilling prophecy, I can't impeach because I did what you said to do during my election. Anyway, Judiciary Committee Democrats met late Monday night to decide how to handle their response to McGahn's non-appearance. The panel decided to move ahead with Tuesday's session and will likely hold a contempt vote next month against McGahn. So you got to show up, or we put out a chair for you. If you don't fill the chair, we have a meeting about what to do about it. And it takes us a month to get to a contempt vote next month. And then what happens? We say, all right, you're in contempt. And of course, that's when now we're 6 months in, and our real progress here is, okay, we send DOJ a referral and they say, no, we're not doing anything about it. And then we have a hearing about they're not doing anything about it. And we say, William Barr, you are invited to testify about why you are not pressing contempt of Congress charges against Don McGahn. And William Barr says, so what? I'm not coming. Well, a month later, you're not coming. We subpoena you. Then he doesn't come a month later. We subpoena you. When should I? All right. When does the subpoena say I should be here? The next month after that. All right. Then we put out another empty chair and Barr doesn't show up. And then we say, all right, month after that, we're going to have a vote on contempt of Congress for William Barr. You see what's going on here? So now, where are we? We're 5 months in. We got a judge to say the law is what the law is. Judiciary Committee Democrats meet yesterday to say, what are we going to do about McGahn if he doesn't show today? Now we're at 5 months. McGahn doesn't show. Next month, 6, we'll hold a contempt vote against McGahn. 6 months. We then say, all right, refer to the DOJ. How long do we wait before we decide that the DOJ is not doing anything? Or they issue a statement that says they probably won't. Do we take their word for it? Whatever. Month 7, DOJ says we're not prosecuting McGahn. Month 7, we then say, all right, well then, fine. You need to come to Congress and explain yourself. Come here by month 8. William Barr says no in month 8. So in month 9, we have a vote on contempt for Barr. And then by month 10, it takes us up to 10 months to figure out, hey, we're probably not going to get the response we want when we ask William Barr to prosecute William Barr for contempt of Congress. That's going to be tough. So now we're 10 months in, maybe up to 11 months in. And then, of course, that's like December, January. In December, of course, everybody wants to get out for the holidays and needs to leave. So we might even push this into January. January, of course, we turn the calendar over. Now the calendar says it's 2020. It's an election year. We can't be doing this in an election year. We don't have to vote for another 11 months, but it's an election year, which by definition is a year long. So I'm sorry, we can't do it. We need to wait until after the election. We have to hold an election now, during which, by the way, you all have to go out there and campaign for re-election so that we hold the House. And when you do it, be sure you go out there and say you are not running on impeachment, so that next year, or when impeachment becomes necessary, if impeachment were to become necessary. And you know what? Impeachment stays necessary. Let me just remind everybody once again, another one of those small historical errors that we make assumptions about. Yes, Donald Trump can lose in 2020, graciously agree to vacate the White House on January 20th, 2021, and still be impeached and impeachable on January 21st, 2021. You can impeach Donald Trump on January 22nd, 2051, if you want to. There's nothing about having left office that forecloses the impeachment option. We all just think, well, it wouldn't make, quote unquote, any sense. But there are several reasons why it would, and it doesn't matter what you think makes sense. There is a reality out there, and it says, no, there's no reason why a person who has left office is not impeachable. There are plenty of reasons why they would be. There are plenty of remedies for a conviction on impeachment, and those are that's the reason. It's not if the only punishment were removal from office, the only possible punishment, you might have an argument, maybe, even then only maybe, that you can't impeach someone who has already left office. All right. So this is how long this thing is going to take. Where were we here? Yes. So Jeffries said we didn't run on impeachment, yada, yada. Judiciary Committee Dems met Monday to decide what to do. Maybe they'll vote contempt next month. Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler, he's from New York, said Trump and the White House intimidated McGahn into not appearing before his panel, which, if you believe that's the case, you got a whole other inquiry to look into and should be looking to impeach him for that. The president's continuing lawless conduct is making it harder and harder to rule out impeachment or any other enforcement mechanism, Nadler said. Trump and White House officials have blocked Democrats' attempts to obtain the president's taxes and a record of his personal finances, an unredacted version of the Mueller report, as well as testimony from Mueller directly, more information on Russian interference in the 2016 election, and internal documents on Trump's immigration and environmental policies, among other issues. Those are all impeachable, obviously, but Congress very rarely is excited about getting there. And it's a fairly routine thing for presidents to refuse. Usually, though, it's unusual for them to refuse to give over information about their personal finances in order to block an avenue of inquiry into their possible corruption. But that's because most presidents don't actually maintain those corruption lines of credit during their presidency. So, yes, it's a little unusual. Usually they're arguing over the appearance of cabinet members to testify about something that, could lead to trouble, or subpoenaing background information that they claim is covered by executive privilege. But there are not that many instruments that Congress has at their disposal to force compliance. Impeachment is the bluntest of them, but it underlies all the rest of them. So, where were we here? The Trump administration has refused to honor the Democratic subpoenas. Again, Democratic subpoenas. The second Politico article that gets that wrong. Surprise. With Attorney General William Barr failing to even show up for a House Judiciary Committee hearing on the Mueller report, which will be interesting because later when they subpoena him to answer questions about who ordered McGahn not to show up and why the Justice Department isn't prosecuting McGahn for contempt of Congress, they're going to pretend once more that William Barr will show up for a hearing on why he's not prosecuting McGahn. And we'll have to wait a month for him not to show up, even though he's already not shown up for the House Judiciary Committee in the context of the Mueller report. The Judiciary Committee then voted to hold Barr in contempt. And what has happened with that, by the way? Nothing. And it won't for a long time. Democrats won a legal victory on Monday when a federal judge ruled against Trump's attempt to prevent the House Oversight and Reform Committee from obtaining Trump's financial records from his accounting firm. We discussed that already. Trump's lawyers had argued that the committee was not entitled to the records and would immediately appeal. Yet impeaching Trump or even beginning an impeachment inquiry against Trump is a huge risk for Democrats, they state flatly. Pelosi and her allies complain the anti-Trump fervor is overwhelming the Democratic message on their agenda. And claim that most of the rank and file is against the move. We'll see. Now we got to phone them one by one, I guess. Democratic leaders also fear that impeaching Trump in the House, only to see him acquitted by the Senate, would strengthen his hand in 2020, although that's highly dubious as well. But there's a growing chorus of pro-impeachment Democrats, and they're being egged on by outside groups, outside agitators, I knew it, that argue Trump needs to be removed from office. Pelosi, though, insists Democrats are all on the same page, despite Monday's drama. There's no divide, Pelosi said as she exited the Capitol. We're fine. And that's the only statement that I support out of that whole thing. That's what she absolutely has to say and should. Okay. What other things do we have to discuss here? Quite a lot, of course, but now we're practically out of time. We could stay on the issue and note, let's see, there's roll calls reporting on this thing. The Don McGahn no-show could be the turning point on impeachment, reports or opines, perhaps. Lindsey McPherson, who cites Cicilline here and his discussion with Pelosi. The Rhode Island Democrat cited a pattern from the White House to impede our investigation and is not alone in the leadership ranks. This is a cover-up by the White House, and there comes a point where we have to stand up for the rule of law, Cicilline said on Monday. It is not just about this president. It's about future presidents. I think I've said that. It's about the message it sends about our respect for the Constitution and for the rule of law. And if this pattern by the president continues, and it has, where he's going to impede and prevent and undermine our ability to gather evidence to do our job, we're going to be left with no choice. Cicilline, who chairs the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, and again, an internal Democratic caucus function, said he was not speaking on behalf of leadership or the Judiciary panel. Opening an impeachment inquiry is a means to collect information and would not require the committee to rush to a decision, he said, noting that the impeachment inquiry into President Richard Nixon during Watergate scandal was open for many months. We have deferred in every way and attempted to accommodate the White House in every way, but we have a responsibility. We have a job to do, and we intend to do it, Cicilline said. Earlier Monday, the president ordered McGahn not to testify Tuesday, with the administration saying the former advisor has absolute immunity. That's a quote. and is not legally required to comply with a congressional subpoena. The move was not unexpected given Trump's oppose all the subpoenas stance since the conclusion of the Mueller investigation last month, but it further escalates the separation of powers showdown between Trump administration and Congress. In a letter to Jerry Nadler, White House counsel Pat Cipollone wrote that an internal Justice Department opinion determined that Congress cannot compel the president's senior advisors to testify about their official duties. Asked about Cicilline's comments on opening an impeachment inquiry, Assistant Speaker, that's a new job created in I guess in this Congress. That's it. So they need to give people offices and plums within the Democratic caucus. That's Ben Ray Lujan. Recalled House Intelligence Chairman Adam Schiff saying something similar last week and said he agreed with his assessment. Ted Lieu, Judiciary Committee member and DPCC co-chair, would that be the internal is it policy? What is it? Policy communications. Who was Cicilline? Was a member, right? The Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, DPCC. Also, this is Liu, also agreed that the panel should open an impeachment inquiry if McGahn doesn't show. Hopefully the White House would make it so we don't have to take more drastic steps, but that's up to the White House. Senior-most leaders, though, still not on board with opening an impeachment inquiry. Not yet, says House Majority Whip Clyburn on Monday when asked if they should start an inquiry. He doesn't think McGahn skipping the scheduled hearings would trigger that. Hakeem Jeffries, same thing, though he noted that the situation is becoming more serious by the minute. I agree with Speaker Pelosi that the case should be compelling, the evidence must be overwhelming, and the sentiment around impeachment should be bipartisan in nature. Of course, it is now, but not enough for them. We're still in the fact-gathering process, and we're still waiting for the facts to come in, too, because they keep getting ordered to give us the facts, and they just don't do it. Let's see. Let's skip on down here. Jamie Raskin chimes in. The logic of an impeachment inquiry becomes overwhelming if McGahn doesn't show up. This is for both procedural and substantive reasons. Procedurally, we need to have an impeachment inquiry so that our investigative powers are honored and respected. Maybe. Substantively, the administration again is displaying its complete and utter contempt for Congress and disregard for the rule of law, so it brings us to a dramatic tipping point. There's more out there, including comments from Steve Vladeck on Twitter. Steve Vladeck, of course, the University of Texas law professor who we've heard from quite frequently in the past. He says, this is the key point in this whole thing. The OLC's opinion says the president can direct McGahn not to testify. It identifies absolutely zero legal basis through which the president could stop McGahn from appearing voluntarily. But I don't think McGahn actually wants to go. If such a basis existed, trust me, OLC would have cited it. He is speaking to the tweet from Zoe Tillman. Zoe Tillman, a reporter covering this stuff for BuzzFeed News. And Zoe's got looks like a rather lengthy tweet thread on this, beginning with the tweet yesterday that the DOJ has released a new opinion from the Office of Legal Counsel, OLC, saying Don McGahn isn't legally required to testify before Congress. She also notes that she deleted a previous tweet that didn't specify that he's a former White House counsel. And here is the document. And she parses it by tweeting further. McGahn, who featured prominently in the obstruction section of Mueller's report, was subpoenaed to testify before the Judiciary Committee. Stephen Engel, head of the OLC, wrote that Congress cannot, quote, constitutionally compel top White House advisors to testify about official duties. Engel writes that because McGahn is shielded by immunity and the president can order him not to testify, McGahn can't be held civilly or criminally liable for following that directive, aka, that's I.E., not AKA. Shouldn't say AKA. Also known as? No. He can't be held in contempt. That's the new OLC argument. Not only does he not have to show up, but you can't charge him with contempt. Today's OLC opinion says McGahn isn't legally required to appear before Congress. It does not say that he can't testify, though. Engel writes that presidents occasionally have made senior advisors available to Congress, but that isn't a waiver of immunity. Constitutional law expert Steve Vladek, who we started with here, says there's no legal mechanisms for Trump to enforce his directive that McGahn not testify. That is, the White House couldn't do anything to stop him from going. Vladek says if there were such a thing, I need to turn my sound down here. If there were such an OLC opinion, we would surely have cited it. Shifting gears for a moment, Zoe says, back to the subpoena of former White House counsel Don McGahn, which Trump has directed McGahn to rebuff. Judiciary Committee Chairman Nadler released a statement saying they're going to convene the hearing tomorrow and that they expect McGahn to show up. I mean, that is to say, I don't think they actually expect him to show up. They think it would be necessary. They think that he's required to show up, but he's not. And they don't really think that he's going to comply either. What Nadler's statement does not say is what they'll do if and when McGahn doesn't show up. The OLC opinion issued by DOJ earlier today argues that Congress can't hold someone in contempt for invoking immunity under these circumstances. As expected, we see this added now 11 minutes ago. Former White House counsel Don McGahn did not show up for the House Judiciary Committee today per a subpoena. See this thread for the background. Nadler didn't reference pursuing contempt in his opening remarks, but said they're prepared to go to court to enforce the subpoena. Good freaking luck is all I can say to that. So that's where we stand at this point. 2 hours about the rulings yesterday. And I think we gave you some pretty good in-depth coverage. Unfortunately, we ignored a million other things that also require in-depth coverage. Let's see. Good bet that Justice Putnam picks up a bunch of these things. Will we cover them tomorrow when we have Greg Dworkin and Joan McCarter with us? Almost certainly. Some of them will come up, but I'll give you a preview of what I'm thinking of so you can either read up about it or hold your breath until Thursday or Friday if we don't get to them tomorrow. But some of these we're going to hit. Big news over at the IRS. Two very different stories. Maybe not that different, actually. Stories, including one from ProPublica, which discovered that the IRS has pretty much given up fighting political dark money groups. At the same time, we also find, to no one's surprise, that the IRS and its diminished budget and under threat also from this president, I'm sure, has reduced the rate at which upper income households are getting audited as well. In other words, the more money you make, the less likely it is that you will get audited by percentage, not just by raw numbers. So something happening over at the IRS. Gee whiz, how did that happen? And any other big story of the day, which I can't believe we didn't spend 2 hours on. NBC News reporting Russian documents reveal desire to sow racial discord and violence in the U.S. Can you believe it? It's only what's been being alleged for 2 years now, but we'll get to that and see if we can't pull it off in the near future. All right, let's see. It's just about time. Oh, wake up, computer, for us to, turn off the alarm and then get ready to wind things up here and see if we can't get you some summary and some peek at what Justice Putnam is going to be doing in his hour following us. Right? Why don't we just jump over there to that and we'll make ready with the music afterwards and then have a little chat over the rest of it if we need to. We can give him all the time he needs here. The West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy is what's coming up next, and the title of the program Justice is going to be bringing you, as always, every day. Like I told you that, like you need to be reminded. Okay, Conrad Black hasn't been pardoned for even 24 hours, or hadn't been pardoned for even 24 hours before Neil Cavuto invited him on Fox to attack the FBI and the U.S. court system. Oh, so part of a coordinated campaign. I don't know if you saw, if you care anymore, to watch Trump's rallies, but he spent most of a rally in, was he up in Pennsylvania? Spent most of his rally time there, or at least a significant chunk, calling for, well, the arrests of everybody in the FBI. Screw the FBI. Arrest everybody. Arrest all our law enforcement agents. Comey and the rest. Lock them up, too. That's where we are in this country. All while the Air Force One is looming in the background, being used as a prop despite promises earlier on. Remember these from the White House not to use it as a prop? Oh, well, that's out the window. Oh, let's see. The rest of the menu for today. Republicans are undermining Michigan's redistricting effort. The Pence Mafia is working behind the scenes to kill women's health care. And Democrats demand a review of Putin ally Oleg Deripaska's big new investment in Mitch McConnell's home state. I'll bet you that Joan McCarthy will have something to say about that. And then after the break, moving on, the Department of Homeland Security issued a warning about data threats from Chinese-made drones. And a group of reporters and their editor at the Russian daily Kommersant resigned en masse against the firing of two colleagues over a report on a reshuffle of Putin's closest allies. Keep an eye on
From
those
Daily
Russians.
Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
So there you have it. 2 full hours on the legal developments of yesterday, even without Armando on hand, and the discussions inside the Democratic caucus about what to do next. And you can see how these things will take 5 months and you'll get nowhere. If we can spend 2 hours talking about the fact that they have spent 5 months getting nowhere.